The morning Karen Whitfield wielded a sledgehammer against the Willowbrook Estate's decorative bridge, she had no idea Mrs. Henderson's Prius would plunge straight through the splintered planks into the retention pond below. The splash echoed across the manicured lawns like a gunshot, followed by the distinctive sound of a car horn blaring underwater. "Well, that wasn't supposed to happen," Karen muttered, adjusting her HOA ESIDENT badge as bubbles rose from the submerged vehicle. 20 minutes earlier, Karen had been standing in her immaculate kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, delivering what she considered the performance of her lifetime to the county permits office. "Yes, I understand demolition requires permits," she'd said, her voice dripping with the authority of someone who'd memorized Robert's Rules of Order. "But this is an emergency safety violation that threatens the entire community." The lie rolled off her tongue effortlessly. The truth was far more petty. The Hendersons had been parking their guests' cars near the bridge during weekend barbecues, and Karen's carefully crafted "no parking within 50 feet of decorative structures" rule wasn't being enforced fast enough for her liking. Now, watching Mrs. Henderson emerge from the pond like a drenched suburban Poseidon, Karen experienced something she rarely felt: doubt. Not about her authority, of course, but about her execution. "Karen White," he filed. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried across the water with surprising force for someone who'd just survived an impromptu car baptism. "What have you done?" Karen straightened her blazer and approached the pond's edge with the measured stride of someone who'd practiced walking authoritatively in front of her bedroom mirror. "Mrs. Henderson, I can explain. The bridge was a safety hazard, and as HOA president, my car is undefiled." "Yes, I can see that," Karen replied, pulling out her phone. "I'll need to document this for the incident report. Could you please spell your insurance company's name?" Mrs. Henderson stared at her with the kind of expression typically reserved for people who just witnessed someone set fire to a library. "You deliberately destroyed the bridge while I was driving over it. I had no way of knowing you'd be using an unauthorized route at 7:23 a.m. Karen countered, checking her Apple Watch. The bridge demolition was scheduled for 7:15 a.m. "You're 8 minutes late to wherever you were going, which, I might add, appears to be a violation of the No Loud Engines Before 8 a.m. clause in Section 12B of the Community Guidelines." The small crowd that had gathered, mostly dog walkers and early morning joggers, watched the exchange with the rapt attention of people witnessing either a comedy show or a mental breakdown. Karen couldn't tell which, but she suspected it didn't matter. "You can't just destroy community property," shouted Bill Martinez from across the pond. "That bridge cost us $12,000. Karen turned toward him with the slow, deliberate movement of a tank turret acquiring its target. "Actually, Bill, if you'd attended last month's board meeting, which you didn't, you'd know that I have executive authority to address immediate safety concerns. The bridge's structural integrity was compromised by repeated misuse." "What misuse?" Mrs. Henderson demanded, water still dripping from her designer cardigan. Karen gestured toward the remnants of the bridge with theatrical precision. "Unauthorized pedestrian traffic during non-designated hours, improper vehicle proximity, and most egregiously, failure to submit proper maintenance requests when residents noticed the decorative stones were becoming loose." The crowd's murmur grew louder, a low rumble of discontent that Karen had learned to interpret as the sound of people beginning to organize against her. She'd heard it before, during the Great Mailbox Color Controversy of 2019, the Forbidden Garden Gnome Incident of 2021, and the recent Grass Height Enforcement campaign that had resulted in 3 formal complaints to the county. But this felt different. This felt like the sound of people who'd finally had enough. "I'm calling the police," Mrs. Henderson announced, pulling her waterlogged phone from her purse. "I'm calling my lawyer," added Bill Martinez. "I'm calling Channel 7 News," declared Janet Wu, the neighborhood's unofficial gossip coordinator and social media influencer. Karen felt a familiar sensation in her chest, not quite panic, but the specific type of anxiety that came from realizing she might have finally pushed things too far. She'd built her entire identity around being the community's guardian, the one person willing to enforce the rules that kept Willowbrook Estates the pristine suburban paradise it was meant to be. The problem was, she'd never stopped to consider what happened when the Guardian became the threat. As sirens wailed in the distance and Mrs. Henderson's Prius settled deeper into the murky pond water, Karen made a decision that would either save her reputation or destroy it completely. She was going to double down. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, raising her voice above the growing chaos, "what you've witnessed today is not destruction, it's renovation, and it's only the beginning." The police report listed Karen's offense as reckless endangerment with a sledgehammer, which she privately thought sounded more like a wrestling move than a criminal charge. Sitting in the county jail's surprisingly comfortable holding cell, she reviewed the cascade of disasters that had followed the bridge incident with the methodical precision she usually reserved for HOA violation notices. The tow truck had taken 4 hours to extract Mrs. Henderson's Prius from the pond, during which time Channel 7 News had broadcast live footage of Karen arguing with the fire chief about whether the retention pond counted as navigable waters under maritime law. The internet had been less kind. #BridgeKaren was trending on TikTok, with particular attention paid to her declaration that the bridge demolition was only the beginning. "You have visitors," announced Officer Rodriguez, unlocking the cell door. Karen expected her lawyer, or perhaps her husband Dave, returning with bail money and his characteristic expression of resigned bewilderment. Instead, she found herself face to face with the entire Willowbrook Estates HOA board: Bill Martinez, Janet Wu, Tom Patterson, and most surprisingly, Mrs. Henderson, now wearing a dry tracksuit and an expression that could cut glass. "We need to talk," Mrs. Henderson said. They gathered in the jail's conference room, a beige nightmare that reminded Karen of every corporate meeting she'd ever dominated. But this time, the power dynamic had shifted in ways she was still calculating. The board voted. Bill announced without preamble, "You're suspended as president, effective immediately." Karen felt something cold settle in her stomach. On what grounds? Destruction of community property, reckless endangerment, and Tom Patterson consulted his phone. What the lawyer called gross abuse of executive authority. Plus, Janet added, "Your little bridge stunt caused $17,000 in damages. The insurance company is refusing to cover it because you didn't have proper permits." Karen had faced rebellion before, but never with this level of coordination. These people had learned to organize against her, and the realization was both terrifying and oddly impressive. "You can't suspend me," she said, falling back on the rules that had always been her armor. According to the bylaws, a president can only be removed by majority vote of the homeowners, not the board. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, her voice quiet but deadly. "Karen, my car is at the bottom of a pond because you had a tantrum about parking spaces. Do you really think the homeowners are going to side with you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a structure fire. Karen looked around the table at faces that had once deferred to her judgment, had once appreciated her dedication to maintaining their property values and community standards. Now they looked at her with something between pity and disgust. "I was protecting our community," Karen said, hearing the weakness in her own voice. "Everything I've done has been about maintaining standards, preserving what we've built together. You destroyed a bridge with a sledgehammer while someone was driving over it." Tom said flatly, "That's not protection, Karen. That's destruction." For the first time in her 5-year tenure as HOA president, Karen found herself without a response. The rules she'd memorized, the authority she'd wielded, the careful structure of power she'd built, none of it mattered when faced with the simple truth of what she'd done. "The homeowners' meeting is scheduled for Friday," Bill continued. "You can present your case then. Until that time, Janet will serve as interim president." Janet Wu, who'd never even attended a board meeting until last year, who'd gotten 3 violation notices for her unauthorized flower boxes, who'd once called Karen a suburban dictator on the neighborhood Facebook page, Janet Wu was now in charge. "I'll need my files," Karen said quietly. "The violation tracking spreadsheets, the maintenance schedules, the vendor contracts. We'll handle the transition." Janet interrupted. "You should focus on your legal situation." They left her sitting in the conference room, still wearing the clothes she'd put on that morning when she'd been the unquestioned authority in Willowbrook Estates. Through the window, she could see the parking lot where Dade's car waited to take her home to a house that suddenly felt foreign. Her phone buzzed with notifications. Reporters wanting interviews, neighbors leaving voicemails that ranged from supportive to venomous, and a text from her daughter in college that simply read, "Mom, what the hell?" But there was one message that made her pause. It was from the county permits office, and it wasn't about the bridge demolition. It was about her application to install speed bumps throughout the community, an application she'd submitted 6 months ago and had nearly forgotten about. The permit had been approved. Karen stared at the message, then at the detention center's fluorescent lights, then at her reflection in the conference room's window. She looked like a woman who just lost everything she'd spent years building. But as she read the permit approval again, she realized something the board hadn't considered in their rush to remove her. She might no longer be president, but she was still a homeowner, and homeowners had rights. Karen Whitfield smiled for the first time since the bridge collapsed and began planning her next move. The community thought they'd seen the last of HOA Karen's renovations. They were wrong.